My name's Kate Ingram and I'm a vet. I graduated from the Royal Vet College in London in 2003. I then worked in practice both in the UK and Australia and New Zealand for 8 years before I entered the pharmaceutical industry. I currently work for Virbac as a technical advisor, covering or supporting their ruminant product portfolio both in the UK and Ireland. And my role really involves working with the territory managers to support their customers. So that's the vets, the trade, and I do some work with farmers directly as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about, I suppose, trace minerals and the importance of trace minerals in livestock and cattle production systems?
Trace minerals are minerals that are vital to animal health. They're involved in a huge number of processes within the body: immune function, fertility, growth, responding to stress. But they're actually only needed in minute quantities. So examples would be selenium, zinc, manganese, chromium, copper. All of those minerals, they're called trace minerals, and they're only required in very small amounts, but they're vital.
And I suppose how do these affect livestock trace minerals? Like what impact do they have if cattle have sufficient levels or insufficient levels?
Well, they have a multitude of roles. As I said, they're involved in immune function. So the immune cells, when they're responding to either a disease challenge or vaccination, they need these trace minerals to work really and to create antibodies, for example. They're also required in areas such as fertility. So having good quality oocytes or eggs to be produced requires these trace minerals to be present. The steroid hormones, for example, so estrogen, progesterone, testosterone in males, they all need manganese, for example, to be generated and synthesized. The oxidative stress, mitigating the effects of oxidative stress, so the antioxidant enzymes all require trace minerals. So really there's loads and loads of different roles within the body that need trace minerals to be present in good levels to meet that demand.
Yeah, and then I suppose like with trace minerals, like there's a number of different administration routes, but what I suppose would you find is the best and why?
Well, we believe that actually injectable trace minerals is the best option, and that's for a number of reasons. So orally administered trace minerals can have variable uptake, and that's because just naturally a lot of them have quite poor bioavailability, which means if you fed copper, for example, actually less than 5% of what you feed will get absorbed by the animal. Similarly, selenium, only about 34% of what you're feeding gets absorbed. So that's one reason. Another reason is that trace minerals fed orally can be affected by antagonists. So antagonists in the diet, such as sulfur or molybdenum, can reduce how much of what you're feeding is actually absorbed by the animal and available to the animal. Yeah. And so what you're feeding, you're not actually sure that the animal is getting exactly what you're feeding it. The other benefit of an injectable is that it can be administered specifically to the weight of the animal. So you're giving it exactly what it needs. And because you're injecting it, it is getting the right dose for the size of the animal. Another benefit is very fast acting, so they'll often get into the bloodstream very quickly and then potentially into the liver if that's the trace mineral that you're looking for is stored in the liver. So there are a number of reasons why we believe that injectable would be more beneficial than feeding orally.
I suppose what are some of the biggest challenges farmers are facing with regards, I suppose, fertility and in general with livestock production, and how can injectable trace minerals help with any of these challenges?
So I would say there's a number of challenges facing farmers, but probably the rising costs and therefore maintaining profitability of their farms. And of course, trace minerals are not the golden bullet, and there are loads of factors that will be contributing to how profitable farms are. But what trace minerals are doing is making sure that their animals are performing at their very best. So they're not being limited by a deficiency or even a subclinical deficiency in trace minerals. So it's around things like making sure the animals have as strong an immune system as they can have, so they can fight off disease more effectively or maximize the response to the vaccines you've invested in. So you will hopefully get less disease, and therefore obviously that will have a cost benefit. The other element is making sure animals are as fertile as they can be. So we know that even a few percent improvement in conception rate is really going to help in terms of profitability, efficiencies, especially in your sort of block calving systems that you have here, where really trying to get cows in calf quickly and in a tight block has a lot will drive your profitability. So as I say, trace minerals it's all about sort of improving the health and productivity of your animals in multiple different areas.
Yeah. And I suppose as farmers with breeding cattle on their farms will know, or indeed farmers with all types of cattle on their farm will know, there's a number of, I suppose, key stress points at various different times of the year. I suppose, what are these key stress points, and how can injectable trace minerals help with these stress points?
Well, as you say, there are a number of stress points, but if we start with probably the biggest, which would be the transition period. So during this period, your cows, they are in the last trimester of pregnancy. So they have a high demand for trace minerals at this point, not only for themselves in that they are about to start producing colostrum, preparing themselves for lactation, but also their developing fetus is taking minerals from them. So the source of minerals for a fetus or a calf is its mother when it's in utero. So the demand for trace minerals is high. Then you've obviously got the calving process. So that has a high demand for trace minerals because the cow is suddenly having to switch into lactating. She will also be at quite a high risk of disease at this point. So this is when we see those fresh cow diseases at their highest, mastitis, for example, endometritis. And that means that their immune system is having to really step up. So trace minerals are important to allow that immune system to function as well as it possibly can. Also, remember that during the transition period, it's likely that the cow's dry matter intake will be reducing, and therefore her intake of trace minerals, if you're administering them orally, will be affected. So you have this kind of perfect storm of a high demand period at the same time as the intakes may be dropping, and that's when you can start to see this subclinical deficiency. It may not manifest as a clinical disease, but it could be impinging her performance. So that would be why making sure that they're topped up ahead of that high demand period is really important.
Yeah, and of course, like farmers, it can often be seen on farms where you see maybe cattle with dull coats, or maybe fertility in herds which maybe isn't as good as it should be. I suppose, what's their offering, I suppose, to help solve this?
I mean, there are lots of different factors that will impact a cow's fertility, but making sure that they have good levels of trace minerals is important. So again, the reproductive system has a high demand for trace minerals in terms of the steroid hormone, so estrogen, progesterone. That's important for not only ensuring good estrus, good quality oocytes, which is the egg, but also maintaining pregnancy. So progesterone is important for maintaining pregnancies. So making sure they've got plenty of these trace minerals on board ahead of the time that they're going to need them is important. And the other important factor with fertility is mitigating the effects of oxidative stress. So animals that are under stress will produce high levels of free radicals. Now, the body has a system in place to mop those free radicals up, and that's the antioxidant enzymes. But in periods of high stress, you can get the point where more free radicals are being produced than can be sort of neutralized. And that's when you start to have issues with potentially subclinical issues such as mastitis, or it could be affecting fertility too. So making sure the trace mineral levels are high so that they have plenty of these antioxidant enzymes on board to mop up the free radicals is important too.
Yeah, and I suppose then just even you see like in recent years there's been an increase in the number of farmers, I suppose, using sexed semen and fixed time AI. So I suppose these farmers, they want to see high conception rates on the first time round. I suppose, what are some of the key things they should be looking out for, and how can Virbac, I suppose, be of any assistance here?
So again, we know that sex semen is an investment. So it's about maximizing the ability of your heifers, probably in this example, to actually conceive. So trace minerals is one factor that you can control to really try and maximize their ability to conceive. And we believe that if you have trace minerals on board, injectable trace minerals particularly on board ahead of that fixed time AI period, it can help maximize the conception rates. And there was a study that looked at the impact of injectable trace minerals on conception rates. I mean, it was done in a suckler system, but they injected cattle about 3 months before they calved, and then they gave them a second dose 30 days before a fixed time AI program. And they found that cattle that had had an injectable trace mineral had a higher conception rate to that first service. So it was around about 9% higher. The overall pregnancy rate was no different across the group. So they put a bull in afterwards, but had a greater proportion of the group that had trace minerals calved in the first 3 weeks of the block. So if you've got a block calving system, the more you can get to calve in that first few weeks, the better. So again, it's this example of it may only improve conception rates by a few percent, but when we're looking at marginal gains and returning on investment, then actually those few percent make a big difference.
And you've mentioned it already there, Kate, but there's a number of stress points, I suppose, in breeding cattle. But just to go back through, like I suppose in a cow, what would be some of these key stress points?
We talked about the transition period. I talked about really the late pregnancy into calving, but actually the first sort of 30 days in milk or 6 weeks in milk is a very high demand period for trace minerals and a high stress point. So at this point, we're asking our cows to recover from giving birth. So we're wanting their uterus to return to normal, eliminate any bacteria or infection that they have. We want them to come back cycling again, and we want them to do that all quite quickly at the same time as producing lots of milk. And so anything we can do to help her reduce the risk of disease in that period is going to help. So again, trace minerals and immune function are so important. So we know that if they've got good levels of trace minerals, it helps make sure that they can produce lots of antibodies in response to challenge, the white blood cell activity. We also know that animals that have been topped up with trace minerals have higher levels of antioxidant activity. So again, this would be a period of high oxidative stress for these cows.
Yeah, and we have mentioned it already, but just to touch on it again, I suppose another key stress point is for cows, and it's one that's really important that farmers get right, is in the run up to breeding. I suppose it's really important that farmers have, I suppose, everything right and nice and steady in the lead up to breeding. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, again, it's about making sure that the cows recover from calving quickly, are not limited by having to fight off any other diseases, and are able to start cycling quickly with good quality oocytes ready for and fertile for when they are inseminated. Again, another study that helps highlight this is a study where they injected, this is on commercial dairy herds in the US, where they injected injectable trace minerals during the transition period. So at dry off, again, pre-calving, and then they gave a third dose 35 days in milk. And they found that cattle that had or cows that had had trace minerals during that transition period had less clinical mastitis, less subclinical mastitis, less endometritis, and fewer stillbirths. So again, it has that benefit in the fertility from making sure that they are less likely to have endometritis, which will limit their fertility, but also it's reducing those fresh cow diseases like mastitis. So anything that may well be sort of, they're putting energy into fighting off disease rather than being able to get back in calf.
Yeah, and Kate, we've talked a lot about, I suppose, breeding animals and animals for reproduction, but also there's a number of stress points for, we say, freshly weaned calves and weanlings in the autumn, times during vaccination, and even calves. How can injectable trace minerals be of value here?
So injectable trace minerals are used extensively actually in young stock right from birth, and we know that calves particularly have a high amount of demand for trace minerals. So the just fast growing animals use up a lot of trace minerals just in that process of growing quickly. But these animals are often the animals that are being challenged with disease. So we see highest rates of pneumonia, scour, for example, in this group of animals. So their immune system is being challenged, and that in itself has a high demand for trace minerals. We're often vaccinating them. Again, the body, to be able to respond effectively to vaccines, needs trace minerals. So we've seen real benefits on units where they have been supplementing with injectable trace minerals, this group of animals. So response to vaccinations, again, there's studies that show if in animals that have had pneumonia vaccines, for example, when they've given an injectable trace mineral alongside that vaccine, they've seen higher levels of antibodies in response to that vaccine in the animals that have had injectable trace minerals. They've also seen a greater proportion of the group responding to the vaccine or seroconverting than in the non-vaccinated animals at an earlier point. There's lots of benefits, and mainly it's to do with that boosting their immune system when they really need it.
So obviously, Kate, you're a vet yourself and you've talked a lot about injectable trace minerals here. I suppose what makes these injectable trace minerals different to the other supplements that are out there?
The benefit really is the fact that by injecting these trace minerals, you're bypassing the rumen environment. We know that when you administer trace minerals orally, you have issues with bioavailability. So large proportions of what you're feeding don't get absorbed into the animal. You can also have issues with antagonists. And when you're injecting it straight into the animal, you don't have those problems. It also works very quickly. So it can be in the bloodstream within 8 hours, in the liver within 24 hours. You also have the benefit of being able to dose according to the weight of the animal. So you can give the exact amount it needs, and you can different sizes of animal in the group will get the right dose for what they need. And the other benefit, and this would probably be more of a farmer benefit, is that you're not having to physically restrain animals to try and bolus them, which can be really quite difficult as they get bigger and wilder.
And I suppose, how does injectable trace minerals affect marginal gains on farms?
As I said, so trace minerals, again, they're not golden bullets, but they are helping you maximize the performance of your animals. So boosting immune function, boosting fertility, maximizing response to vaccination. And yes, you may only see small percentage increases at these points, but all of that will add up to help improve productivity and profitability.
So, Kate, obviously we have to ask this one. Farmers will want to know, do you think there is an economic return on investment when using injectable trace minerals?
Absolutely. If you can reduce disease rates, then you will be reducing costs. Not only direct costs in using less antibiotic, less medicines, but also those indirect costs, which might be reduced growth rates when you've got pneumonia, or reduced feed conversion efficiencies, for example. So yes, if you can reduce disease, you will be saving yourself money. Also, if you can improve fertility, if you can improve conception rates, they will all have an economic benefit. Reducing mastitis in your freshly calved cows, reducing endometritis, again, is all going to reduce the amount of antibiotics that you're using and reduce the costs to your farm.
I suppose, have you any statistics that you can give surrounding the effects of using injectable trace minerals on livestock or on cattle?
There are a number of studies that have looked at the impact of injectable trace minerals in multiple different animals or groups of animals. So we talked earlier about a study that was done in suckler animals that looked at the improved conception rates in animals that had injectable trace minerals prior to fixed time AI. There's studies done in dairy cows looking at supplementing during the transition period and seeing less mastitis, clinical mastitis, endometritis, and stillbirths. There's a number of studies looking at calves and the impact on disease rates in calves. So less pneumonia, less scour and otitis. There's also studies looking at its use alongside vaccination. So boosting the response to vaccination, boosting the antibody levels, affecting how quickly animals will respond to vaccination. So yes, there's a huge amount of data out there which supports how injectable trace minerals can affect positively any number of different groups of animals.
And I suppose we've talked about a lot of scenarios where injectable trace minerals can be used. Are there any other scenarios beside some of these where they can be used? So, for example, is it of any relevance to, say, calves in a suckler system, or maybe calves in a dairy calf to beef system?
Yes, I would say we've seen a lot of people start to use injectable trace minerals in these calf rearing units. So dairy calves coming onto the finishing units or rearing units. Yes, so that's a very high stress time for animals. Often they'll have gone through collecting yards, perhaps they may be being mixed with other groups of calves from different units, different age groups potentially. So that's a very high risk period in terms of disease because of the stress they're under. And we've seen a lot of people using injectable trace minerals to try and mitigate the effects of those stressful points or that stress, and therefore reducing the rates of pneumonia, reducing the need for antibiotics. So it certainly does fit well into the calf rearing sort of systems. Suckler beef animals, again, it's about trying to think about the point at which this system might be having the stress point. So in a suckler system, it might be if you've got animals being housed and being vaccinated for pneumonia, for example, in the winter, that might be a point at which injectable trace minerals could be beneficial, maximising the response to that vaccine and also mitigating the effects of the stress of moving or housing or transport, for example.
So we have seen cases where calves have been born on farms and there may have been issues with mineral deficiencies. Can you inject newborn calves with minerals?
So there's sort of two elements to that question. Yes, injectable trace minerals can absolutely be used to treat deficiencies, or clinical deficiencies, perhaps where they've had a deficiency diagnosed. Absolutely, it's a good option for trying to correct those deficiencies. But yes, also there are products out there that you can use from birth. So we know that actually newborn calves do have a high demand for trace minerals. They're totally dependent on what they got from their mothers when they were in utero. So if you have perhaps a deficient mother, then perhaps you could end up having quite low levels in the calves. Birth itself is quite a stressful event for a calf, and it can have an impact in oxidative stress. So injecting trace minerals at birth, it can absolutely be a good idea in certain units.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us here today. And I suppose, how can farmers find out a little bit more about whether they need to include injectable trace minerals in their animal health plans?
Oh, well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you, Agriland. I would say that the best person to talk to is going to be their vet. So I would encourage you to go and talk to your vets about the trace mineral requirements for your cattle when the high demand periods might be in your system, and how injectable trace minerals might benefit your cattle.
Thank you very much, Kate.
Welcome.